So Canada just shifted its aluminum exports to Europe. Not a marginal adjustment, not a seasonal reallocation triggered by pricing differentials or contract rollovers. A deliberate, large-scale, structurally permanent redirection of Canadian primary aluminum. The raw material that American aerospace companies build planes with, that American automakers stamp car bodies from, that American defense contractors fabricate military vehicles and naval vessels out of, that American beverage companies form into the 300 million cans Americans drink from every single day away from the United States and into European smelters, fabricators, and manufacturers that are paying premium prices, signing decade-long contracts, and building their industrial futures on Canadian metal that was until this quarter flowing almost exclusively south. The impact hit American industry with a breadth that no previous supply disruption in the confrontation had matched, because aluminum is not a single sector commodity. Aluminum is everywhere. It is in the fuselage of every commercial aircraft Boeing delivers. It is in the body panels, engine blocks, and structural frames of every vehicle rolling off every American assembly line. It is in the electrical transmission lines that carry power from plant to home. It is in the window frames of every commercial building under construction. It is in the casing of every smartphone, the housing of every laptop, the heat sinks of every data center server. It is in the military, the armor plating of fighting vehicles, the superstructure of naval destroyers, the skin of fighter jets. And it is in the can of soda sitting on your desk right now. When Canada shifts aluminum, it doesn't hit one industry. It hits the entire manufacturing economy simultaneously. Warren Buffett said, "Aluminum is the commodity that connects everything, the material that sits at the intersection of aerospace, automotive, defense, construction, technology, and consumer goods," and that the Canadian shift revealed a dependency so broad that most Americans couldn't see it because it was literally everywhere they looked. But it's what Carney said about why the shift follows the same logic as the lumber redirection, not retaliation, but rational market behavior by producers who found better buyers, and what the numbers reveal about how deeply American manufacturing is wired to Canadian smelters. That tells you this isn't an aluminum story. When you hear where Canadian aluminum is going, which American industries are being hit hardest, and what Buffett explained about the cost of losing a supplier that is embedded in everything you make, you'll understand why this is the supply crisis that the American industrial base cannot survive without solving. Hit subscribe because the production shutdowns are already beginning. To understand why this supply shift constitutes an industrial emergency rather than a commodity market fluctuation, you need to understand the scale and the specificity of the American dependency on Canadian aluminum. Canada is the fourth largest aluminum producer in the world and the largest supplier to the United States by a factor that makes the dependency structural rather than preferential. Approximately 60% of all primary aluminum imported by the United States comes from Canada. Not because Canadian aluminum is cheaper. It is competitively priced, but not the lowest cost global option. Because Canadian aluminum is produced using hydroelectric power, which gives it the lowest carbon footprint of any primary aluminum in the world, which makes it the only aluminum that meets the increasingly stringent environmental and procurement standards of American aerospace, automotive, and defense manufacturers. The carbon dimension is what makes the dependency irreplaceable. Global aluminum production is one of the most energy-intensive industrial processes in existence. Smelting aluminum requires enormous quantities of electricity and the carbon footprint of the final product is determined almost entirely by the source of that electricity. Chinese aluminum, which accounts for roughly 60% of global production, is produced overwhelmingly with coal-fired electricity, giving it a carbon intensity 4 to 5 times higher than Canadian aluminum. Middle Eastern aluminum, produced primarily in the Gulf states, uses natural gas, lower carbon than coal, but significantly higher than hydroelectric. Australian aluminum uses a mix of coal and gas. Russian aluminum, historically a significant global source, has been restricted by sanctions. Canadian aluminum, smelted in Quebec and British Columbia using hydroelectric power that produces effectively zero carbon emissions, occupies a unique position in global supply. It is the only large-scale source of primary aluminum that meets the green aluminum specifications that Boeing, General Motors, Ford, Lockheed Martin, and the U.S. Department of Defense have adopted or are in the process of adopting as mandatory procurement standards. American Aerospace cannot use high-carbon aluminum because its customers, airlines operating under European emissions trading schemes, governments with decarbonization mandates, corporate procurement policies requiring life cycle carbon accounting, are increasingly requiring documentation of the carbon intensity of every material in every aircraft. American automakers face the same trajectory as fuel economy standards, ESG reporting requirements, and consumer demand for low-carbon vehicles drive procurement toward verified green materials. The U.S. Department of Defense's own decarbonization roadmap, published 18 months ago, explicitly identifies low-carbon aluminum as a strategic material and Canadian supply as the primary source. The dependency is not a market preference. It is a specification. American manufacturers need green aluminum. Canada produces green aluminum, and the gap between need and availability just widened catastrophically. The European shift began the same way the lumber shift began, with better offers from buyers who were not at war with the seller. European aluminum fabricators facing their own supply constraints as Russian aluminum was restricted by sanctions, and as European smelters struggled with energy costs that had been elevated since the natural gas crisis, turned to Canada with offers that the American market could not match. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, a regulation that imposes tariffs on imported goods based on their embedded carbon intensity, had created a structural premium for low-carbon aluminum in European markets. Canadian hydroelectric aluminum, with its near-zero carbon footprint, entered the European market not just tariff-free, but at a competitive advantage over every other global source. European buyers were not paying more for Canadian aluminum out of charity. They were paying more because the regulatory environment made low-carbon aluminum more valuable in Europe than anywhere else on Earth. And Canada was the only supplier that could deliver it at scale. The contracts followed the pattern established by the lumber shift, long-term, high-volume, penalty-protected agreements that locked Canadian supply into European channels for 5 to 10 years. Alcoa's Canadian smelting operations in Quebec, the largest aluminum production complex in North America, signed a 7-year primary aluminum supply agreement with a consortium of European aerospace fabricators worth an estimated $3.8 billion. Rio Tinto's British Columbia smelters redirected 40% of output to European automotive manufacturers under a 10-year framework that included shared investment in downstream processing facilities in Germany and the Netherlands. Alouette, the largest single aluminum smelter in the Americas, announced that European contracts would constitute the majority of its forward order book for the first time in the facility's 30-year operating history. In eventual addition, basic and smaller Canadian smelters. The mid-scale operations in Quebec's Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region that had supplied American manufacturers for decades reported that European buyers were offering prices 18 to 23% above American market rates, with contract terms that provided revenue certainty American buyers could not match, because American buyers were operating under tariff regimes that made every transaction a political variable. The volume redirection was massive. Within 120 days, Canadian aluminum exports to the United States declined by 28%, approximately 1.9 million metric tons annually that had been flowing to American smelters, fabricators, and manufacturers for decades, and that was now flowing to European ones. The decline was concentrated in precisely the grades and specifications that American industry needed most: aerospace-grade alloy stock, automotive body sheet, and defense specification plate. Commercial-grade aluminum for construction and packaging was also affected, but the premium-grade redirection hit American advanced manufacturing with disproportionate force, because premium grades have the fewest alternative sources and the longest qualification timelines for new suppliers. And then American factories started feeling it. The aerospace sector was the first to report disruptions, because aerospace supply chains operate on the tightest specifications and the longest lead times. Boeing's commercial aircraft division reported within 60 days that aluminum alloy sheet deliveries from Canadian suppliers had fallen below contracted minimums, triggering supply chain contingency protocols that had not been activated since the post-pandemic recovery. The company's Everett, Washington facility, the largest building by volume in the world where wide-body aircraft are assembled, reported that production scheduling for the 787 Dreamliner had been adjusted to accommodate aluminum delivery uncertainty. Adjusted is the corporate euphemism for delayed. Each day of delay in aircraft production cost Boeing an estimated $12 million in deferred revenue. Spirit AeroSystems, the major fuselage manufacturer that supplies both Boeing and Airbus, reported similar disruptions at its Wichita facility. One aerospace supply chain executive said in an industry publication, "We are rationing aluminum alloy sheet across our production lines for the first time since I joined this company 23 years ago. Rationing in the American aerospace industry because our primary supplier found better customers." The automotive sector followed within weeks. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, the three largest American-based automakers, reported that aluminum body panel supply was tightening in ways that would affect production schedules within 90 days. The shift to aluminum-intensive vehicle design, driven by fuel efficiency requirements that favor aluminum's lightweight over steel, had dramatically increased the automotive industry's aluminum consumption over the previous decade. Ford's F-150, the best-selling vehicle in America, uses an aluminum body that requires approximately 900 pounds of aluminum sheet per truck. At Ford's Dearborn and Kansas City assembly plants, which together produce over 700,000 F-150s annually, aluminum supply disruption translates directly into production cuts that translate directly into dealer inventory shortages, that translate directly into price increases, that translate directly into the sticker price that American consumers pay. Ford's head of procurement said in an internal communication that was reported within the week, "We are 45 days from production impact. If Canadian aluminum supply is not restored or replaced, we will reduce F-150 production by an estimated 15 to 20% in the fourth quarter. 15 to 20% of the best-selling vehicle in America. Because the aluminum is sailing to Europe, the defense dimension added a layer of national security urgency that elevated the crisis beyond commercial disruption. The Department of Defense is the largest single consumer of specialty aluminum in the United States, armor plate for fighting vehicles, structural alloy for naval vessel construction, aerospace-grade sheet for military aircraft. The F-35, the fighter jet that the Pentagon had tried to force Canada to buy, requires approximately 20,000 pounds of aluminum per aircraft, predominantly sourced from Canadian smelters. Because Canadian aluminum meets the carbon and specification requirements that the Defense Department's own procurement standards mandate. The irony was lost on no one. The Pentagon had threatened to dismantle the defense relationship with Canada over the Griffin purchase, and was now discovering that the aluminum needed to build its own fighter jets was leaving the country because of the broader confrontation the Pentagon had helped escalate. A retired defense procurement official said, "We threatened Canada for not buying our jet. Now we can't get the aluminum to build our own jet." There is a word for this kind of strategic planning, and it is not a word I can use on television. The consumer products dimension, less strategically significant but more universally visible, completed the picture. The American beverage industry consumes approximately 35 billion aluminum cans annually. Aluminum sheet for can manufacturing had historically been sourced from a combination of domestic recycled aluminum and imported Canadian primary stock. The Canadian supply shift tightened the primary aluminum market, which in turn tightened the can sheet market, which in turn produced price increases that beverage companies announced they would pass through to consumers. Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Anheuser-Busch, InBev, and Molson Coors all issued forward guidance adjustments within the same week, citing aluminum cost increases as a primary driver. One beverage industry analyst captured the absurdity with precision. The aluminum in an American beer can used to come from a smelter in Quebec, powered by a hydroelectric dam on the Saguenay River. That aluminum now goes to a brewery in Munich. The American brewery gets its aluminum from a smelter in the Middle East, powered by natural gas at a higher price, with a higher carbon footprint and a longer shipping time. Every variable got worse. The beer costs more, and the reason is a trade war that has nothing to do with beer. And then Carney spoke, and the framing was identical to the lumber shift. Deliberately, strategically, devastatingly identical, because the principle was the same, and repeating it reinforced the lesson that the White House had failed to learn from the first application. The setting was a joint appearance with the CEO of Rio Tinto at a smelter in Kitimat, British Columbia, one of the most advanced aluminum production facilities in the world, powered entirely by hydroelectric energy, producing aluminum with a carbon footprint a fraction of the global average. The visual was industrial rather than political. Molten metal, massive pot lines, the physical reality of a product that the world's most advanced manufacturers need, and that this facility produces. Carney said, "I want to address the narrative that Canada's weaponizing its aluminum supply. We are not. Canadian aluminum producers are private companies operating in a global market. They sell to the buyers who offer the best terms. For decades, the best terms were American. That is no longer the case. European buyers are offering higher prices. European regulators have created a market that specifically values the low-carbon aluminum that Canadian hydroelectric smelters uniquely produce. European partners are offering decadal-long contracts with investment-sharing provisions that build lasting commercial relationships. And European governments are not imposing tariffs on Canadian aluminum, are not threatening Canadian industries, and are not waging economic confrontation against the nation that produces the metal their factories need. Our aluminum producers have not been ordered to redirect supply. They have been outbid. And being outbid by a buyer who offers more money and less hostility is not retaliation. It is the market working exactly as markets work. Then he delivered 11 words that extended the principle he had established with lumber into a universal truth about supply chain economics that was now being carved into the strategic assessments of every industrial nation on earth. He said, "You cannot wage war on your supply chain and keep your supply chain." The phrase landed with the accumulated weight of every previous Carney statement, each one building on the last, each one restating the same fundamental principle in language specific to the commodity being discussed, together forming a doctrine that trade strategists were already calling the Carney principle, that economic coercion against a supplier is self-defeating because the supplier always has the option of finding better customers, and the buyer who drove them away cannot quickly or cheaply replace what was lost. The phrase trended alongside its predecessors. You don't demand what you depend on. You can't tariff your supplier and expect them to stay, forming a trilogy of supply chain truths that together constituted the most devastating critique of American trade strategy that any foreign leader had articulated. Warren Buffett's response identified the dimension that made aluminum structurally different from every previous commodity in the confrontation, and that made the consequences potentially more severe. He spoke with the focused intensity of a man who understood that aluminum's ubiquity, the fact that it appears in virtually every manufactured product, meant that the supply disruption would not be contained to a single industry, but would cascade across the entire manufacturing economy. Every previous supply disruption in this confrontation affected a sector, Buffett said. Energy affected energy-dependent industries. Lumber affected construction. Food affected grocery prices. Airspace affected aviation. Each one was serious. Each one was damaging. But each one was bounded. Aluminum is not bounded. Aluminum is in everything. It is in the plane you fly on. It is in the car you drive. It is in the building you work in. It is in the phone in your pocket. It is in the can you drink from. It is in the electrical grid that powers your home. It is in the weapons that defend your country. When you lose your aluminum supply, you don't lose a sector. You degrade every sector simultaneously. And that is a fundamentally different kind of crisis. Not a supply chain disruption, but an industrial-based degradation. He drew the business parallel with the precision of a man who has owned manufacturing companies and managed their supply chains for decades. I've owned companies that depend on a single critical input, and I've learned that the value of that input is not measured by its price. It is measured by what happens when you can't get it. A company that can't get its critical input doesn't just pay more, it stops producing. And a company that stops producing doesn't just lose revenue, it loses customers. And a company that loses customers doesn't just lose market share, it loses its future. Because customers who find alternative suppliers while you're unable to deliver don't come back when your supply problems are resolved. They stay with the supplier who was there when you weren't. That cascade from supply disruption to production stoppage to customer loss to permanent market share erosion is exactly what is happening right now across American manufacturing. Boeing can't get aluminum, so Airbus gains orders. Ford can't get aluminum, so Toyota gains sales. American defense contractors can't get aluminum, so allied nations accelerate procurement from European manufacturers. The supply problem becomes a production problem becomes a competitiveness problem. And competitiveness problems are not temporary. Buffett went deeper into why the green aluminum dimension made replacement functionally impossible within any realistic time frame. People will say, buy aluminum from somewhere else, from China, from the Middle East, from Russia if sanctions allow. And the answer is you can't. Not if you need green aluminum. Not if your procurement standards require low-carbon material. Not if your customers demand life cycle carbon documentation. Not if your government's own defense decarbonization roadmap specifies hydroelectric source aluminum. Canadian aluminum is not interchangeable with Chinese aluminum. They are chemically identical and environmentally opposite. And in a world where carbon is increasingly priced, where European border adjustments penalize high carbon imports, where ESG mandates govern institutional investment, where consumers and governments increasingly demand verified sustainable supply chains. The distinction between green aluminum and conventional aluminum is not a preference. It is a market barrier. Canadian green aluminum has a market. Chinese coal-fired aluminum has a different shrinking market. And America just lost access to the market that is growing. His closing compressed the entire crisis into language that connected aluminum to the series thesis he had been building across every previous installment. The pattern is now undeniable. Energy, lumber, food, airspace, water, aluminum. Every critical input that the American economy depends on from Canadian supply has been disrupted not by Canadian aggression, but by American policy that made Canada's market hostile, while better markets existed elsewhere. Each disruption individually is a crisis. Together, they constitute something I have never seen in 70 years of investing. The systematic degradation of an industrial economy's supply base through the self-inflicted destruction of its most important supplier relationship. This is not a trade war. Trade wars end. This is an industrial unwinding. And industrial unwindings take generations to reverse. He paused. You don't fix a supply chain you spent 2 years destroying with a phone call and a handshake. You fix it the way you built it over decades, with investment, with reliability, with trust. And trust is the one thing this confrontation has eliminated from the vocabulary of the bilateral relationship. The domestic political fallout was immediate, and it hit the constituencies that the administration could least afford to lose. Republican members of Congress from districts with aerospace manufacturing, Alabama, Washington, South Carolina, Connecticut, Texas, demanded emergency hearings on aluminum supply security. The Congressional Aluminum Caucus, a bipartisan group that had existed quietly for years, convened an emergency session at which the caucus chair, a Republican from an Ohio district that hosts 3 aluminum fabrication plants, said, "My constituents make things out of aluminum, car parts, aircraft components, building materials. They cannot make those things without aluminum, and their aluminum supply is now going to Europe because this administration's trade policies have made it more profitable for Canadian smelters to sell to German automakers than to American ones." That is not a talking point. That is a plant closure waiting to happen. The governors of manufacturing heavy states formed an unprecedented bipartisan coalition demanding immediate trade resolution. The governors of Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Washington, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, held a joint virtual press conference at which the governor of Michigan said, "My state builds cars. Cars are made of aluminum, Canadian aluminum. Aluminum that is now going to Europe. If this supply shift is not reversed or replaced, we will see auto production cuts in Michigan within 90 days. That means layoffs in the state that cannot afford another round of manufacturing job losses.